be human is to dream. Children dream of romance and adventure. But as they grow, few hold on to their dreams or find the courage to live them. Long ago, a boy in a conservative Canadian town dreamed himself a heroic life, and then went out and lived it. William Leonard Hunt, who would become the Great Farini, felt adventure in his very fiber, but his parents did not. Thomas Hunt was a stern, ambitious Englishman who settled near Port Hope, Ontario in the early 1830s, seeking opportunity. There he met Hannah Soper, who would soon become his wife. On June 10, 1838, 3 years after their marriage in Port Hope's Upper Crust St. Mark's Anglican Church, Hannah gave birth to their first son, William. From the moment he appeared in the world, he seemed to have extraordinary energy.
His son, this person who came along who had all of these desires and emotions and was a rambunctious child, was somebody that Thomas Hunt in some ways feared, because he wanted to present a certain kind of placid and conservative face to that society, and his son made that difficult for him.
The Hunts bought land and cleared it and made a successful farm. Little Willie was sent to a nearby one-room school where he was a daring athlete and a brilliant student. But those promising traits would take him on paths his parents never dreamed of. It happened at the circus. The circuses of the mid-19th century burst onto the dirt roads of backwoods Canada like dreams from children's minds, dangerous dreams that took little Bill Hunt by storm. He had been forbidden to go, but the temptations of an eye-popping street parade featuring 8 Indian elephants were more than he could resist.
Having these small little families, every season becomes like a family. Just like in every household, you got brothers and sisters that don't get along and some that are closer than others, and the circus is also a family like that. I find it very romantic in my eyes.
I never thought of I was going to be in the circus and be a clown. I don't know if my mother thought that either. She probably wanted me to be a doctor or a lawyer or something. But this is a community, you know. People say you might think it's unstable, you know, for everybody. But we travel with the same people every day. So our next door neighbor is our next door neighbor.
It's really funny because my family aren't circus at all. They're very straight and, you know, they wanted me to be a lawyer or whatever. So they weren't taking it too easy. But when I was a little girl, my father used to bounce me on his knee and he'd sing me this little Spanish limerick about his little vagabond. And that's what they call me now, the little vagabond. And they always tell my father, you see, you sang her that song. It was her destiny.
You have to think back to what it was like in those days. There was no television, there were no movies. There wasn't really even much in the way of live entertainment. So when these circuses arrived, and they were American circuses, very loud, very spectacular, and they were just like a fantasy from a child's dreams. And because Little Willie Hunt's dreams were so enormous inside him, these circuses just fit them. I guess one of the best words to use to describe a circus in those days was that it was exotic, all the way from the animals to the performers.
1852, Bill had just turned 14. Pentland's dramatic equestrian circus came to town. He stole inside the big top for a look. Acrobats flew through the air, high rope walkers walked the sky, the atmosphere was charged. Bill thought, this is for me.
Right away, he put up a little copper wire in his barnyard in Bowmanville and started walking on that, and he made a little homemade trapeze and worked out on that, and right from the beginning he was adamant that he was going to learn how to do these things.
Days of obsessive practicing soon made Bill proficient, but his father angry. This was no profession for an intelligent, well-bred lad. Bill continued to dream. Now he designed and put up a high rope from the ground to the roof of a barn. Before long, he had it mastered. 150 years later, his great-great-great-grandniece, Rushmie Baird, caught the dream as well.
The first time I realized I I had maybe a chance, or that maybe it was in the blood or something when I was probably about 9. So that's when the research started for me, and I became interested. I always wanted to do what he did. I love it, and it's one of those things that surges up the middle, and I'm sure I'm supposed to be doing it. It feels natural.
Unlike Rashmi's father, who built her wire for her, Thomas Hunt was humiliated when the neighbors saw his irresponsible son on the high wire. But Bill was determined, and they struck a deal that year in the Hunt household. Bill could keep the high rope if he took up medical studies and apprenticed himself to the local doctor. Common sense and right ambition would surely prevail. But in the summer of 1859, when Bill was 21 and weeks away from his medical examinations, Thomas Hunt took his eye briefly off his son, and fate intervened.
His father went away to England for a trip, and the local agricultural fair committee came to see little Willie Hunt, or Bill Hunt, I guess at the time, and asked him if he would walk a high rope over the Gannaraska River in the center of Port Hope. I think that they were sick of having these boring fairs where they'd have, apple pie contests and that sort of thing, and they really wanted to do something sensational.
This time they wanted more than strawberry jam competitions and political speeches. They wanted to witness a dream, a man walking in the sky.
I don't think they were quite prepared for what they saw the day that they went out to the Hunt barn in Hope Township and watched him, because he got on his little rope that went up from the ground to the top of the barn, carried a friend of his on his back, stood on his head, and they were just astounded at what they saw. And I think at that point they started to think, well, maybe he can actually do this.
And so the scene was set. Bill had read somewhere about an adventurous Italian, one Signor Farini, and seized upon the exotic name. It was a lot more dashing than plain Bill Hunt. And it gave him a disguise. Perhaps his father wouldn't find out. He put up his rope at night, 70 feet above the Gannaraska River, from one 4-story building to another. A fall would be crippling, even fatal. The Tri-Weekly Guide announced his intention in the October 1st edition.
This afternoon at 4 o'clock, Signor Farini will make a grand ascension, as the phrase runs, on a tightrope stretched across the creek from the brick buildings on either side of the stream, north of Walton Street Bridge.
Ladies and gentlemen, Jay Cochran.
Jay Cochran knows all about the Great Farini. On August 21st, 1999, he came to Port Hope to reenact Farini's incredible debut.
When I was about 7 or 8 years old, my mother took me to my first circus, and I saw a man by the name of Harold Ozana, who was in Sudbury, Ontario. He did a somersault on a wire about 25 feet high, a backward somersault. And I said to my mother, Mother, that's what I'm going to do when I grow up. And she said, oh, no, you're not. I said, yes, I am. That's what I'm going to do. I think it's a God-given talent. I do. But it also takes hard work. If you have the love for it, that is part of the talent. And it'll follow. You just follow your dream. It's what I've always wanted to do. And I'm living out a little boy's dream.
Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Jay Cochran, the Prince of the Air, Jay, walk please.
Farini's debut took place on October the 1st, 1859. The Tri-Weekly Guide covered the event.
Pursuant to announcement, Signor Farini on Saturday afternoon walked on a tightrope stretched across the creek. The ascension was advertised to take place at 4 o'clock, but so great was public curiosity that as early as 3 o'clock, a crowd began to collect on the Walton Street Bridge and in every place from which a view of the rope could be obtained. At 5 minutes to 4 o'clock, Signor Farini made his appearance at the western end of his rope. He was attired in silk tights and the other usual clothing of acrobats. Grasping his balancing pole firmly in his hands, he stepped confidently out upon the rope and commenced his journey. He walked slowly but steadily, reaching the building on the east side in safety, and amid the cheers of the assembled thousands.
Like Jay Cochran, Farini entranced the crowd. He stood on his head, hung by his heels, walked the high wire with and without his balancing pole. It was the largest crowd in the town's history. The agricultural fair had never seen the like. But just weeks after he'd conquered Port Hope, his father returned home from England. Farini met him at the train station, a meeting he would never forget. He would write about it later.
And then my father said, "I am grieved by what you have done. The news was a great shock to me, and now, instead of being penitent for the shameful manner in which you have repaid my kindness and care, you delight in having disgraced your family by becoming a low, common mountebank."
His father just blew up at him, and they had a confrontation there that both of them, I know, remembered for the rest of their lives. And it really was the thing that sent Farini out in the world to pursue his extraordinary life.
Scalding tears of anger started from my eyes as I went forth into the open air. I would not darken my father's doors again. Mountebank though I was, the world lay before me.
Farini's wanderings, almost inevitably, led him to Niagara Falls, to the world's greatest high wire, and to the famed acrobat, the Frenchman Blondin. Farini arrived in July 1860.
Blondin had essentially said to the world that nobody else on the face of the earth could walk a high rope over Niagara Gorge. Farini thought that he could do it, and he thought that it was wrong for Blondin to say that nobody could do it, because he felt that almost anybody could do almost anything if they got up their courage and tried. Farini was very concerned about the idea that there are certain things in life that people thought were superhuman. The high wire appears to be that way, but you can actually get on it and walk it. You just have to pay attention to the technique. You keep your eyes riveted on the wire about 5 or 10 feet in front of you. You get your hands straight up in the air, your chest out, and make sure that you control the wire and it does not control you. Away you go. Ta-da! So he started putting up his rope, and he put it in a spot that was at the widest point in the gorge, 1,800 feet across, wider than any rope that's ever been there. And Blondin had actually moved downstream about a mile for that season. I think he was absolutely stunned to see that this guy, this 22-year-old guy who'd been practicing a high rope for 10 months and really was almost like a semi-pro, was actually going to take him on.
That corner over there is where the Clifton House was located. Now he crossed slightly below, that is downriver, so it would have been right about in line with this. Now the original description of where he crossed from, so he crossed from the American side. A place called Niagara House, now that's long gone, but would have been approximately where that clearing is in the trees.
And so Bill Hunt, age 22, self-taught in a barnyard, and Monsieur Blondin, the most storied acrobat on earth, lined up for competition. At 10 minutes to 4 on the afternoon of August the 15th, Farini got into a horse-drawn carriage at the American Hotel in Niagara Falls, New York, and was taken to the wooden platform next to his long, drooping 1,800-foot cable.
So he started out holding this enormous balance pole, and he went down. Of course, he started descending immediately as he went down on his rope. Probably a little bit frightened, although he claimed that he wasn't. Now, then he went out a little bit further, and I think he knew he had to do something spectacular at this point to really show them that he was capable. So when he got out about 100 feet or something like that, he put his head down to the rope and stood on his head. And I think that was the moment when the Blondin-Farini duel began. But he had much more to do that day. He hung by his hands from the rope, eventually hung by one hand, if you can imagine. Then he hooked his feet over the rope and hung by his feet, and eventually pulled one foot back and hung by 1 foot. And then on the way back, he went out carrying a rope that he put down vertically from his rope, and actually went down that rope to the Maid of the Mist, had a glass of wine to show that he was there with somebody on the Maid of the Mist, and then climbed back up. Now you can imagine what it would take physically and mentally to do something like that. And by the time he was 3/4 of the way up the rope, he was totally spent. And he barely made it up the rope onto the main cable. And he was finally able, with shaking arms and shaking legs, to get up on the rope. And then he had to get back. So very slowly he made his way back to the other side, and he was met with this tremendous reaction of applause and so on when he reached there.
Blondin, a mile or so downstream, had another perfect day on his taut 800-foot cable. Critics thought Farini more terrifying to watch on his unstable slack wire, Blondin more elegant and proficient. But the upstart Canadian bested his opponent in ways that must have galled. His crowds were bigger, and he made more money. It was the greatest slack wire performance on record, said the Niagara Falls Gazette. But we never wish to see another such performance by any rope walker. For however safe the performer may consider himself, there is no pleasure to the beholder. Farini was delighted. Now the crowds would have to come.
Well, throughout that summer, they had a duel. Blondin on his 800-foot rope and Farini on his 1,800-foot slack rope. So when Blondin went out and carried a stove on his back and cooked eggs, Farini carried a washing machine across. When Blondin decided that he would carry a man on his back, Farini carried a taller and a heavier man.
Farini began pushing the duel into truly dangerous territory, and his next feat nearly finished him.
Blondin had walked with a sack covering himself, so Blondin's had gone over his head. I think there were holes for his arms, and away he went across the gorge. Now, Farini always felt that he had to one-up everything that Blondin did. He decided, well, I'll put a sack over my entire body. All there was holes for his arms, and it was a glazed cambric sack, so it was actually somewhat slippery. And the rope immediately descends from the platform. And as soon as he got on the rope, he started to slip, and he slid down into the gorge. And most of the reporters and spectators who were watching him that day just thought, that's the end. Farini's going to die. He's taking it too far. But he was able to stop himself and somehow edged all the way back, got himself out of the sack, put his shoes on outside the sack, and then walked very, very slowly out to the center of the rope. And when he got close to the center of the rope, boom, he flipped up into a headstand. And you could see the sack blowing in the wind.
He looked like a small sail spread to the breeze, marveled one reporter. In September, the Prince of Wales, the dashing 19-year-old son of Queen Victoria, made an historic trip to Niagara Falls. The visit would indirectly color the rope-walking duel and unfairly make Blondin seem the winner.
The prince watched Blondin, was quite amazed by him, and he was quoted as saying, "Thank God it's over," when it ended. And there was a story that was put about at the time that he did not see Farini walk. But the fact that history recorded that the prince watched Blondin and did not watch Farini was something that did not help Farini's reputation in history, because there have to be highlights that people will remember, and one of them was the prince watching Blondin, not Farini.
When he went by the rope and saw it, he asked, what was that? And the Duke of Newcastle, who was the head of his retinue, was reported to have replied, "A pathway for another fool." So apparently the Duke of Newcastle didn't think too much of either Blondin or Farini.
For the two fools, the duel was now over. Blondin had again proved himself a legendary performer, but Farini had drawn larger crowds and given more thrills and made more money, and showed the world that the Superman was human, like the rest of us. Farini left Niagara and went, of all places, back home. But his attitude and dandified dress made him even more of an outcast than before, so he took up with an unconventional girlfriend named Mary Osborne, and they took off in search of adventure. Their life together would soon come to a crashing end. Farini and Mary returned to Niagara, where he told the press he was going to carry Mary on his back over the Horseshoe Falls. But a pre-war depression was keeping tourists away. Even the Maid of the Mist had been sold. So he and Mary, his daring Signora Farini, headed for Havana. It was green and gold and beautiful, with wide avenues and palm trees and ornate theaters. And a bull ring, the Plaza de Toros, with 60-foot walls and 30,000 tiered seats. Here, the Farinis were scheduled to perform their incredible feats. It began brilliantly.
Mary was on his back. They started across, they performed all of the routines, and when he got to the end, for some reason, Mary Osborne acknowledged the applause of the audience and turned and waved to them. And that is a cardinal sin for somebody being carried on a high wire walker's back. And at that instant, she slipped and fell from his back. And as she started to fall, he allowed himself to go with her. And he hooked one of his legs around the wire, reached down and grabbed the hem of her dress and caught her. And was actually at that point saving her. But slowly the dress ripped out of his hands and she fell down to the seats. And he watched her spiral all the way down and crash headfirst into the seats.
5 days later, she died. The heartbroken Farini had her buried at a prominent Catholic church, and her funeral was a major social event. Farini was so moved that he had himself baptized as Guillermo, a Latinized William, and Antonio for his Cuban godfather. And they began to whisper that he had a young son. Farini vanished for a while after that, licking his wounds, perhaps. But in the summer of 1864, he surfaced in New York City.
He came to a beautiful theater which was run by P.T. Barnum called the Hippotheatron, and he performed there as the Farini brothers, and he did all sorts of different acts. He walked on a wire, he did strength routines, he did acrobatic maneuvers, he did a stationary trapeze act, and he even had a kind of a funny name for himself. He called himself a pen gymnastic on arrow stations, which was really a way of describing somebody who did all sorts of different gymnastic feats. In August of 1864, Farini came to Niagara Falls for what would have been the third time, and he performed probably the most bizarre feat, maybe, that any human being has ever performed. What he attempted to do was to walk along almost the very brink of the American Falls at Niagara. So on August 8, 1864, Farini strapped on his stilts and stepped into the raging rapids at the top of the American Falls at Niagara. Now, when he got out about a third of the way across, one of his stilts got stuck into a crevice in the water, and he wasn't able to get it out. He either fell in, or he snapped the stilt off because he felt that he was caught. So at this point, he's being swept at a tremendous speed toward the very edge of the American Falls in almost certain death. It's like the ultimate cliffhanger. But of course, Farini was thinking all the time, and he reached out and grabbed the branch of a tree and pulled himself up onto this island. But then, of course, the problem was he was stuck on this little island in the middle of the American Falls. The New York Times discovered about it, wrote an article about it while he was sitting there, and a lot of people came to see him, and the idea was that they would actually watch a man starve right in front of him. But he eventually figured out a way. He got a rope across, and he either walked on the rope or held onto the rope and pulled himself across and got to safety and survived again.
After this brush with death, Farini headed for London, the center of the universe. A perfect place for a 27-year-old Canadian with never-ending dreams. He debuted at the Cremorne Gardens, and an expertly trained young protege soon emerged as a phenomenon. His stage name was El Nino, the boy, or perhaps the son. Where had he come from, this 8-year-old? A runaway, plucked from the streets of Boston? Or was he the natural child of Farini and Mary Osborne? Farini adopted him formally, gave him his name, and a prominent role in his life from then on. El Nino was beautiful with silky blonde curls. On stage, he seemed as daring as his father. He flew 40 feet through the air from trapeze to trapeze. His photographs sold by the thousands, and a reporter for the Daily Telegraph was captivated.
A boy scarcely 8 years old, who at a height which it would be painful to contemplate, takes some astounding flights and plays a remarkable solo on the drum whilst swinging through the air, with his head bent back over the bar of a trapeze. The gracefulness of the child does much to lessen the feeling of peril attached to the performance, but there is a general sense of relief in witnessing his descent in safety.
By August, the Flying Farinis were booked into the Royal Alhambra Palace, a gorgeous theater in the center of London. The Farinis were a huge sensation. London was a world-class place to be a hit, and their fame grew rapidly. Robert Coote even composed a waltz about them titled The Farini. The Flying Farinis toured England and Ireland for several years. When they played the legendary Crystal Palace in 1867, their feet 70 feet in the air amazed reporters, and a crowd of 22,000 jammed the floor and 5 galleries. As the 1870s began, Farini entered a new phase of life. He was 31 now. He knew the dangers of continuing those on-the-edge feats. He went into seclusion with El Nino in Marseille. He grew a long black beard and played the dark, mysterious genius. But soon it would be time to come out again, into the ring and the lights. They would begin to call him the father of the big thrill acts. His first creation was an absolute sensation. Lulu, the eighth wonder of the world, appeared July the 29th, 1870 at the magnificent 4,000-seat Impératrice Theatre on the Champs-Élysées. The land of Blondin had discriminating tastes in circus arts, but when the blonde-haired, blue-eyed 16-year-old beauty came forward and suddenly leapt 25 feet into the air, they were stunned. She settled lightly on a carpeted plank set between 2 trapeze bars. A vase de cristal, said L'Avenir National. It was something from a dream.
Then Farini took Lulu to England and debuted her there in 1871, and she performed at the Royal Holborn Amphitheatre. Prince of Wales came to see her perform, and she just went from one success to the other, and he toured her throughout England and in the United States. She performed on Broadway, New York City, Chicago, Philadelphia, all over the place. And a great many gentlemen would appear backstage and knock on the stage door and see if they could speak to her, take her out, give her flowers. She was known not just as being a great trapeze artist for this great Lulu leap, but also for being very attractive.
Somehow, a year later, Farini was back in England, in Portsmouth, where he married a grocer's daughter named Alice Carpenter. We don't know where they met, but we do know that they had 2 children with princely names, William and Harry, and that the best man was the beautiful Mademoiselle Lulu. Lulu continued to amaze audiences around the world. The magical leap achieved an astounding 40 feet. The trapeze work was dazzling. Until that night in 1876 in Dublin, when Lulu missed the trapeze bar and crashed to the floor.
Immediately there was pandemonium in the building, but they were able to get her up and take her into a hospital that was close by. And the doctor was quite shocked by what he saw when Lulu took off her clothes, because Lulu wasn't a woman. Lulu was actually Farini's son, El Nino.
Lulu would perform for several more years under her famous name, although mostly as a man. In fact, he would grace the greatest show on earth in the early 1880s with glasses, mustache, and a fetching female costume. He would marry and raise a daughter. Lulu's unveiling may have bothered the gentleman who brought her flowers backstage, but it didn't bother Farini. He loved toying with perception. He presented illusions, performances that challenged science, but had a solid core of honest, almost erotic thrills. Now this ubiquitous showman turns up at the helm of the Royal Westminster Aquarium, a huge entertainment palace in the center of London. It had begun as an institution to educate the masses, but quickly ran into financial difficulties. So they brought in Farini to turn it around, and he knew exactly how. Audiences want to be thrilled. They want to see people risking death, attempting the impossible. Farini's first big show there brought them exactly that. It was explosive. Farini had invented the human cannonball, one of the most sensational feats in the circus. His projectile bullet was a real woman this time, Rosa Matilda Richter. They called her Zazelle. A modern-day projectile at Canada's Garden Brothers Circus is Luis Munoz.
This is what we call a medium cannon, which can propel me up to 110, 115 feet. It's always nervous, of course. You're always hoping you did your right calculations and that everything works okay. Sometimes when I'm in the capsule, this mostly at the beginning, we get so many muscles in our body, you cannot even imagine. So I get all completely rigid, but I forgot to rigid the neck. So when it pulls you, so you do the whiplash, and then maybe you concentrate on tightening the neck, and your knee buckle in, you know. And so there's so many things that you have to be able to concentrate and do, you know, perfectly.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Blast off!
Farini used the same mechanical principle he had devised for Lulu, springing it timed to a noisy burst of smoke. These are the drawings and specs with which he patented both the act and its name, the human cannonball. Zazelle became as big a star as Lulu. She was even the subject of a comic opera. And soon it was rumored that the nefarious black-bearded Farini had a whole stable of Zazelles in case one lost her nerve or got killed. But not all were thrilled by the mysterious signor. In March 1880, a British MP named Edward Jenkins put forward the Dangerous Performances Act, intended to stop the growing and scandalous evil of Farini's thrilling shows. The act was never passed, but England began to seem less hospitable. Farini went through a messy divorce from Alice, and it seemed a good time to leave. So he gathered up his best acts and went to America and joined P.T. Barnum in The Greatest Show on Earth. The Greatest Show on Earth was arguably pretty well what it said it was, and Zazelle was its star. She packed them in for a long run in New York, and then drew as many as 10,000 a night into the big traveling tent. Farini then returned to London, where he became intrigued by human freaks, the most famous of which was Crow, the missing link.
Crow the Missing Link was one of the most famous freaks of the 19th century, and Farini claimed that he found her in the jungles of Siam. In fact, he wrote a book about it. But I think likely he picked her up somewhere in the streets in London, or who knows, the Bronx or something like that. And she was a remarkable human being physically. I mean, she did have some unusual characteristics. I think she was quite hirsute and just had unusual features. But he actually presented her as Darwin's missing link. And we have to remember that this is during a period when Darwin was still alive. So people were really talking about this.
In the very midst of the 1879 Anglo-Zulu War, Farini capitalized on racist fears about African peoples by putting genuine Zulus on display doing war dances and hurling spears. Africa, the dark continent of fascination for Victorians, began to intrigue him and became part of his dreams. This would lead to one of his greatest adventures. In 1885, the great Farini teamed up once more with Lulu, now a photographer in Bridgeport, Connecticut. They left on a 6-month exploration of the challenging Kalahari Desert in the heart of southern Africa. What he reported finding there still has the world puzzled.
Perhaps the most important thing that came out of it, or certainly the most intriguing thing, was that he wrote a book about it called Through the Kalahari Desert, and in that book he claimed that he found the ruins of an ancient civilization deep in the desert. Well, since that day there have been all kinds of searches for that lost city, Farini's famous lost city, and they have never been able to find it. And there are stories about people going out into the desert and falling asleep and waking up and seeing Farini's lost city and falling asleep again and it's disappeared. And so it's become this magical story.
One of the people who has searched for Farini's lost city 19 times and counting is Lee Haldeman.
The lost city is still lost. You're always in a situation that you believe it's just over the next sand dune. The area is vast. You're looking at hundreds of thousands of square kilometers that have to be searched. And you're trying to translate Oxwagon miles into today's terms. And you're using these vague descriptions of saying for 3 days they traveled west. Now that might be northwest or southwest. and you sort of have to guess in which direction the lost city might be.
Natives have spoken of the lost city. Travelers have insisted they've seen it. Books have been written about it, and movies have invoked its image. But somehow it has vanished under the shifting sands. Did it really exist? Or was it just another brilliant illusion in the brilliant mind of a man making his dreams into reality?
Now, if you are the type of showman that Farini appears to have been, you'd have made it much more spectacular. Maybe pyramids or underground caverns and gold and diamonds and things like that, rather than just a rock wall, which also lends credence to Farini's explanation of Lost City.
On his return from the Kalahari, Farini married again. She was the aristocratic Anna Muller, 15 years his junior, and said to be a relative of Wagner and a student of Franz Liszt. She had been raised in the court of the Kaiser. She would be his last wife and the love of his life. Perhaps influenced by her, he adopted a more genteel style than before and began to focus on business, investing in railways and other stocks. He bought a genteel house in the genteel Forest Hill south of London and became co-owner of one of the world's most successful theatrical agencies, Richard Warner's. But he must have missed the risk and the charge of the big thrill acts. In 1888, he brought American aeronaut Thomas Baldwin to the Alexandra Palace north of London, so a crowd of 65,000 could watch him jump out of a hot air balloon at 3,000 feet and descend to Earth in a newfangled thing Farini's critics said would never succeed, a parachute. But Baldwin jumped safely 15 times that season, amazing hundreds of thousands of spectators. Farini and Baldwin's parachute was a success, staking the signor's claim on another very useful invention. He'd been inventing things since childhood. In the census of 1890, the profession he gave to the census takers was just that, inventor. He's been given credit for creating the circus safety net. He actually patented not only the human cannonball, but also the Lulu leap. He invented folding theater chairs, improvements in firearms, and machines to pack bottles. He tried botany and developed new strains of begonias. But the Baldwin parachute stunts marked the end of his life as a showman. His son Harry died. Britain's charms had run dry. Canada beckoned. The Farinis left England for good and moved to Toronto. Here he became involved in one of the strangest inventions in the history of Canadian innovation.
The roller boat was the idea of a fellow named Fred Knapp, and he had the idea that a boat that rolled through the water or rolled over the water like a log would be able to go faster than a boat that had to plow through the water. He secured investors and for the sum of $60,000 built a prototype. Went through sea trials, but unfortunately, the full-sized version didn't prove to be as successful as the model.
The roller boat may have been built by one F.A. Knapp, but it likely was developed from a Farini idea.
Well, that's a matter for considerable debate. It's very clear that there was some interchange of ideas going on between the two of them. There were several patents issued to Fred Knapp, but Farini also got in there with his own patents in 1906.
But in practice, the roller boat was embarrassingly slow. On its maiden voyage, this absurd vessel ran aground not far from Port Hope. It was, perhaps, his only really monumental failure. He had tried to speed up the world, but instead just lost a lot of money. But Farini's appetite for new experience was insatiable. He took up painting. He went at it like a kid with a new bike.
It's a wonderful attempt at a naive kind of painting. He didn't practice his technique a whole lot. He just dove in and did whatever came to his mind next, and it's very confident and technically has some good merit to it.
In 1910, the full painter and his wife moved again, this time to Germany, to be closer to her family. Farini painted and sculpted and soaked up the atmosphere, and somehow managed to weather the war. In 1920, he and Anna left Germany. And now, after a lifetime of wandering, an aging Billy Hunt really did go home to Hope Township, where he owned a number of properties. One of Farini's neighbors in Port Hope was 10-year-old Norman Strong.
I used to see him ever so many times, and I was surprised and astounded. He looked so small and so slight, and he found time when I'd be out cutting the grass to stop and talk to me. And he'd keep complimenting me on doing such a good job. So it shows that he was a very human being in spite of his notoriety. At my age, we thought it was wonderful, but apparently some of the old people thought he was too famous.
William Leonard Hunt, the Great Farini, Guillermo Antonio Farini, exercised every day and rode his bicycle all around Port Hope. He worked outdoors till he was 90. They said he was fit as a boy. If he missed the high life and the old times, he didn't show it, although he would tell great tales and always had time for children. Then in January of 1929, in his 91st year, he caught pneumonia and was taken to the Port Hope Hospital.
I don't think until Shane started to research I'd ever heard the story about my Uncle Ted and my father going to see him the day before he died, and him sitting, bolt upright and steady in his bed reading a newspaper and saying that an old gypsy woman had told him that he'd live to be 100, and this, of course, was the day before he died.
His funeral took place on a rainy winter day in Port Hope. The procession moved up Walton Street, past the place he had first walked the high wire so many years ago. It stopped then at the graveyard.
And his biggest fans were children, and I think it was because his imagination fit their imagination. And they understood that as a little boy he had dreams and that he had gone out and lived them, and they could see that. And also he was somebody who liked to talk to children. And in those days, a lot of people around Port Hope believed that children were to be seen and not heard. And Farini didn't believe that for a second. So he always had time for children. And who could resist a gentleman who could tell you what it was like to stand on a high wire over Niagara Falls or to be shot out of a cannon? It just fit children's imaginations also. And the story goes that when Farini died in Port Hope in 1929, that the children saw the casket going up Walton Street and that they took off their hats as he went by.